I'm gonna keep an eye on Twitch.
Here we go. We are live.
Yo.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hello.
Week 8. So kind of the last one for this season, this round of Score Connect. So this week we have a very juicy interview with our sort of resident mixing mastering engineer, Steve Harrington. So I caught this interview with Steve last week, and it was really great to just kind of ask him a bunch of questions, a bunch of things that I think are kind of quite common questions. And we're also interested to kind of hear some of your takes as well. And feel free to speak up and kind of mention some of your own questions about mixing in the chat as we go, because there may be things that we can just discuss as well. But with Steve, it was great to get his opinion on a lot of these things, to get an expert's opinion on it. So I think he goes in depth quite a bit more into some of these concepts.
So just for those who might not be familiar, Mike, do you want to sort of talk a little bit about Steve's background, or is that one of the questions you ask him?
Yes, I think that would be useful. So yeah, Steve, we know, most of us all know Steve because he has been kind of the head recording and mixing engineer at Royal College of Music since we were students and before. And so Steve is kind of a staple of that. But in that role, he has also seen thousands and thousands of sessions with both students and professionals. Steve is also just a freelance engineer, recording, mixing, mastering. I know, just from knowing him and speaking with him, that kind of his background is originally in mastering as well, is kind of how he trained up. So he was telling me sort of his mentor that he had trained under kind of in the early days was with mastering engineer. So I think he brings kind of that point of view of the final product into every portion of the kind of workflow. So from setting up the microphones all the way through kind of to that end product. And yeah, there's just some really great information in here. So I think maybe with that we can just kind of jump into the first one.
Can I just say a random thing? There's an Icarus X something on the chat that said hi Vinny. I guess I reckon it's for me, but I have no idea who this person is.
You're the only Vinny in here, as far as I'm aware.
I know, unless it's saying hello to some Vinny in the chat. Like, I have no idea who you are. Please tell me who you are. I'm losing my mind trying to understand who that is.
You have too many fans. Too many fans.
Okay, sorry for the off topic. Sorry for the off topic.
So this first bit of the interview, I asked Steve what I think is probably one of the most common questions and kind of pitfalls, is that a lot of people's mixes tend to get very muddy. And mud is something very vague, but very present. So I just asked Steve, kind of as sort of quite a big question, what do you think are some of the main reasons that will make a mix muddy? And I think he had a lot to kind of jump in on with that. So these are audio interviews rather than the video that we had last week, just because I grabbed him in a room with a microphone when I had the chance last week. So I will just give a play.
I mean, it depends if we're talking about a recording in a space or samples. Samples quite often will be recorded quite close. You might have options to use room mics and close mics and bands, but there will be a fairly full-bodied sound with a lot of bottom end perhaps and the mids. And when you pile them all up, and because those samples haven't been performed together, you can end up having lots of that muddiness in the mix. And I guess the first place to go is deciding where you want that warmth, bottom end, interest, and you're probably thinking you want it in your cellos and your strings, warmth down there, but you won't need it necessarily in your winds perhaps as much. And it's just a balance in that. So you can stoop out mids and low end on the bits in your mitts where it's not strictly necessary. And that's quite often the first thing I'm doing with when I'm given a bunch of tracks is figuring out where I want to roll off the bottom end or take things out. Samples often as well, if they're close, they might have a lot of top end, which isn't really muddiness, but they might seem very right in front of you. And one of the first things you can do is roll off some of the top to give it a bit of, but just the impression that it might be a little bit further away. And then once you add reverb and you get the levels and the balance right across the mix, it can give the impression of it being further away than it really is. If you're doing it, if you're recording within a space and you're finding it all too muddy, that could be a lot to do with the room itself. So if we're talking about home recording, maybe a solo line, that's the nature of the room quite a bit, and so EQ's going to help as well. But also if you can deaden the ambience in the room any which way, that might produce less of that muddiness that you're talking about. Yeah, you would tend towards trying to get a drier sound in an acoustic that you didn't like, absolutely, but it's the nature of the beast is you're always going to get some aspect of the room imposing itself on that microphone, even if it's close. And then, of course, as you get too close, the nature of the instrument changes, and it's not really the sound you ideally want. So again, you have to find the halfway ground, and it's good to experiment.
Cool. So I think there's a lot of kind of great tips in that. And just to kind of give a bit of a further explanation on some of what Steve's talking about, he's mostly talking about frequency and kind of using EQ. So when he's talking about rolling off the low or the high end, that's using either a high pass or low pass filter that can then cut out a whole bunch of those extra frequencies. And so to kind of help clarify that a little, I mean, I think he does a pretty good job of clarifying it, but it's that, say, like he mentioned in the woodwinds, you don't need all of that bass information that would be coming through. And it's kind of when you have a whole bunch of those microphones stacking up on top of one another, then you're getting that room and that kind of bassiness of that room 10, 15, 20 times over in the mix. And so that's where a lot of these frequencies really start to add up. So I think it's a really useful tip that he is kind of talking about, which is really to kind of figure out what do you want out of each sound, and then kind of chop the bits out that you don't from those instruments.
Yeah, one thing I found really interesting about what he just said, and as has been a bit clarifying for me, is one of the most important decisions is actually to decide where you want your warmth to come from. Like, which layer of the music are you going to actually allow the mids and the bottom ends to speak through? Because if you just EQ all the middle and bottom out of everything, you're just left with a track with no middle or bottom. So it's like, yeah, that's interesting. You could have a mix where you're like, okay, actually the brass is going to carry the mid and bottom, or the strings are going to carry the mid bottom, or the synthesizer or the piano or something. Like, you don't have to always do it the same way. It depends on what you want the mix to achieve. So I think that's a really interesting point. We have a question here from Laura asking about, she says, do you guys EQ every single instrument in the box, as some composers incorporate that into their template, or rather groups of them, or even the sum of them, or all of them? That's a lot of EQing. I'll just quickly say I did something recently in my template, was that I went through every single preloaded track and I put like a low cut filter below the lowest note of that instrument. So like below the open G of the violin, I've rolled it off. And below the open C of the viola, I've rolled it off. And I went specifically instrument by instrument. And just that small thing has, I think, improved my mixes, or at least made it so that when I start mixing, I don't have to do that work again. Like, I've already got, okay, as much nonsense as I can get out of there of some weird room sound that's in one of the samples, but not the others. it just cleans things up a bit. So I found that very helpful.
Is it fair to, sorry, V, I was going to say, Shane, on that, is it fair to say that you're incorporating that into your template, as Lara's asking? Is that specific to a certain project where you know how clean it needs to be in certain areas for mixing, or is that your template? That's what you're going to use for everything? For
me personally, I've decided I wanted to use that for everything because for me, it just came across as like messy and clumsy. Otherwise, I might be making some mistakes there, but from my experience so far, it has helped. And yeah, I would want to use it on everything because I think it's a better starting point. First, get rid of this stuff we know we don't want. From there, we can do color, EQ. We can do now we can compress it and get a better sound because we're not also compressing the noise that we didn't want. You know what I mean?
I think one thing you said as well, sorry, V, just to add to that.
Go ahead.
One thing you said, Shane, there is adding the low cuts is a massive thing because in my limited experience, which you'll quickly realize today, but I found like doing that on as much as you feel you can clears space for the stuff that is really sub. And then what that means is there's a nice little chunk for your subs, and it means you can clear off the top of the sub, which can, if that ends up kind of summing in that muddy area, I think Steve was kind of talking about. So if you're able to just kind of part the sea a little bit between those two, the bassier instruments and the sub instruments, if you're using those, I found that can help a little bit as well.
Shane, I wanted to ask you, that is very interesting. I never thought of doing that, like using the register of the instrument to chop off the beats that we don't want. I was just curious to ask you one thing about this. Did you load the EQ and then load an analyzer and then play like the lowest note to see what was the response and then work it out?
Basically, like yes. Yeah, that's what I did.
So it's not just like
I thought it was the most sensible because basically, yeah, I just loaded up all the tracks that were in my template and I played the lowest sounding note. And in Cubase anyway, the EQ that is just on the individual like track, I don't even know what it's called. Like when you edit the track, it has like an EQ built into it. And it has a really nice low cut filter in there. And I would just play the lowest note and it actually shows you the frequency response of whatever signal is on that channel at that time. So you can kind of see it. And then I just rolled up until I was like, that is the fundamental. And you can also hover over and it tells you like, this is like 440 hertz or whatever. So you can know exactly that you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, Logic does the same thing. I think it's really interesting, but in terms of the result, was it just like cleaner or did you feel it was also sort of influencing the body, the texture of the instrument itself? Like
I tried to make sure I wasn't doing anything damaging. So for all of the ones I was checking them and trying to listen and say, am I losing anything I don't want to lose here? And if I was, then I would bring it down. So yeah, I was careful to avoid that. Yeah.
In terms of muddiness, have you guys ever experimented with a multi-band imager before? I was only just thinking about this because I was listening specifically to How to Train Your Dragon as we were talking about the stream the other day, in terms of because you know a lot of John Powell stuff is sort of hyper produced to the point if you put an orchestra in a room, you're not going to get that sound that is on the recording. And the interesting thing I noticed is actually a lot of the bulk of the bass sound, because often what times he'll do as well is play like an actual electric bass, doubling the contrabass line beneath it, and that's dead center. And I started listening very intently and noticed that actually the bulk of sort of the bass and cello low frequencies were actually also pushed to the center. I did sort of a spectral analyzer, and so I started experimenting with it a little bit by taking the sort of lowest frequencies and essentially almost making them mono. And weirdly enough, that added a lot of clarity. I mean, it's not actually that weird when you think about it, because it's preventing a lot of the room sound from covering up other things that could possibly interfere. But I didn't know if you guys had ever experimented or had any, had tried that before.
I keep it fairly simple on my end, but because I think most of the samples you work with now anyway are like pre-panned. So, and if you play, a Spitfire Abbey Road or something like that, kind of out of the box, it's all going to be like, it's all designed to just be kind of spaced and leveled and all that together. But I do think about, not necessarily like, I haven't really played with a multi-band imager, but definitely with like a multi-band compressor or EQ, because I think that gives you a lot of control, or even multi-band distortion. when working with like electronic music or something, that you can control like what kind of distortion or something in a particular frequency range. I think that gives you a lot of control.
And keep in mind, I'm not talking necessarily about the actual position of the instrument, because you still hear the cellos and basses on the right as you normally would, but the extra oomph you get from that really low frequency, because you can smush it into a very small space and keep it center. You can keep that as part of the sound without necessarily needing to cut it out. And that was just an interesting revelation. To really listen to some of that stuff.
That reminded me, someone else had suggested a similar technique, basically, just controlling different areas of the frequency spectrum in terms of panning. And I think bass in the middle is very powerful. I haven't tried it myself, but I think it's good.
Mike, sorry.
Go ahead, Sam.
I was just going to highlight one other thing Steve was talking about in the video, if there's time.
Yeah.
He was talking, which I think is really relevant to everyone, which is the dealing with the room that's being recorded in, because quite often, at this kind of level, we're dealing with solo players, maybe even recording themselves. But if you're recording them, it's so important to eliminate the room sound, unless you've got, by chance, a very nice sounding room, which is so rare because it's so hard to get rid of that afterwards. I've just done a solo cello album where I got a friend of mine in isolation, obviously, to record herself, and she'd never done it before, and discovered very quickly that unless there's some kind of shield, we actually just use like a pillow initially behind the mic. Without that, it's like night and day, the difference. Like one is completely unusable because there's just too much, just the room just sounds dreadful.
I will say in the next clip, he talks about reverb, and he does dive into this a little bit more as well.
Let's do it.
Well, just to touch on a couple of things, going back to Laura's question, I think it depends on kind of what you're after, because often I use EQ in groups, and that kind of comes back to what Steve was saying about like choose where you want your warmth. So I'll use an EQ also kind of on like my final stems group buses before like the final mastering kind of output. And that's where I'll sort of do this extra bit of cleanup that's like, okay, the strings occupy this area, the brass occupies this area, that kind of thing. Just it's really more mastering than it is mixing, but you can use EQ kind of at those different stages. So I think you could sort of do all or some of it. And then just silencing Sammy's question, would it be best to check the frequency response of the microphones beforehand? That wouldn't matter, because the frequency response of the microphone is just what is the range of frequency that this microphone can input or can take input from. So whether you're playing a cello or a trumpet into that microphone, you then still have to decide kind of where you would want that warmth or what you would have to cut off. So the frequency response is just what is the entire range of what it can possibly kind of take input of information from. Just as with the speakers, the frequency response is what can it output. So like, the lowest frequency on your speakers is the lowest that you'll hear.
But they might also be talking about like different microphones will color recordings differently. Like they may boost the mids versus another one which might duck the mids. So maybe they meant it that way. I was thinking of something else with EQ that I watched a little kind of mixing tutorial, and they mentioned something that you can think of EQ as having multiple different jobs as well. So you might have, because the question was initially like, do I EQ and then compress, or do I compress and then EQ, which is the correct way to do it? And
Steve actually brings that up in another clip.
Well, maybe because I've misremembered, maybe if I'm misremembering, I might get it wrong. But I think the point this person was making was that you should have one type of EQ to clean it up first, then you can compress it to get the dynamic level you want, and then you use another EQ to color it. So you think of EQ as doing two different jobs, and that can sometimes help, rather than thinking I can only do one thing with EQ and I need to do it all in one stage of the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do that, especially in electronic music, because you kind of need to control and shape the sounds a lot more specifically than when you're dealing with like acoustic orchestral writing. So I definitely sometimes will have the chain exactly that: one EQ, a compressor, and then the same EQ again, or whatever kind of saturation or color or something like that. Cool. Let's jump on to, so this next clip, we got talking about kind of the use of reverb. And so it's sort of a continuation of also like how to deal with the room that you're in and what you're recording with and that sort of thing. So I'll give this a play.
Using too much reverb is another thing to be wary of. Quite often what I will do is high pass a lot of the reverb to reduce what's going into it. You don't really want all that bassiness then waffling around. You generally want a tight, warm bass at the bottom. So again, not sending much of your bass instruments or samples or sounds into reverb is a good start to avoid any muddiness. And you can also, EQ the reverb return as well. Quite often they can come back sounding quite bright and artificial on some of the plug-in versions. So just rolling a bit of that back can help make it a bit more subtle. But yeah, don't overdo the reverb. Don't use too many reverbs, I think, as well. Try and it depends, obviously, what you're mixing. But if you want something to sound like an ensemble in a room, then try and use just one reverb and send the appropriate amount from your mix into it. And it's probably more on when using pads and it's maybe like electro instrument stuff, you want to play around with different types of reverb for effect. But if you're using a consistent one across a mix with a bit of compression then and across the stereo mix as well, it kind of gives the impression of recorded at the same time in the same space rather than distinct solo instruments at different times. Yeah, play around with reverbs. Don't overdo it. Listen to your reverb return. That's often a good idea. Lots of people don't do that, but if you solo that and actually listen to what's coming out of it, you get a much better idea of how much you're putting in or something.
Yeah.
It gives you a greater sense of what it's doing to the mix, I think. But yeah, definitely the first one. Don't put too much bass into it because that will turn out to be waffly and dominate and make a lot of what you put effort into making clarity of the mix. You'll lose it with all that reverb then put on top.
Cool. Yeah, I think there's some great tips in there. Yeah, Steve is super chill.
My God, yes.
I just
addressing Darren's question real quick off the bat. Have any of you used outboard reverbs before? What's the difference between those and the plug-in reverbs? So I think this is will also kind of come up in some of the other clips that we have as well. If you've, for anyone who's at college, or if you've worked in, had any recording studio at your college, or had a chance to go into a studio yourself, probably have an outboard reverb. And the one at Royal College of Music, they have a Lexicon outboard set up. So pretty much any recording that goes through the college will come back through that as well. The main differences between that or I think Steve even touches on this, kind of like using the plug-in version of certain reverbs and that sort of thing, is color. So when you're going through any piece of outboard gear, you're introducing some level of saturation into your mix, which is just color. So just the circuitry of that particular piece of equipment will distort to some degree that sound that's being passed through it. So ultimately, that's what you're getting. And there's lots of pieces of gear that have a really valuable slight distortion to them, that have a particular character and quality that it will give your sound. But I think, and kind of what Steve will bring up later in other clips, is kind of really getting to know what you want out of those. And really getting to learn those is the most valuable thing.
Well, isn't it important to note as well that sort of slight coloration can also be done through different means digitally, not necessarily needing some analog equipment as well?
Be careful, Michael. You're in dangerous territory there. You're straying into the
Well,
into the
I guess
analog
I guess it's
versus
just
digital world.
well, it's a question of the degree to which you're able to even hear the difference between one distortion or another. Because I know I was asking Jake when he was mixing my album whether or not he preferred analog or digital, and he directed me to a video that he had done with Guy Macklemore on YouTube. You can look it up. It's basically a reverb. They do sort of a competition between them, comparing them. And they compare specifically, I think, the digital version of Lexicon and the analog version. And even, Jake in that video said, there's not really much of a difference that at least I can hear. This is Jake Jackson, by the way. So, yeah, I think it's a question of personal preference, but also that slight coloration. What is it that you're hearing in that sound, and can that be replicated through another means?
He did the same video, Michael. Sorry, he did the same video, Michael, with Spitfire. Spitfire of that video. Of
oh, sorry, it was with Christian.
Well, I think that. Sorry, Sam. Continue. Don't want to cut you off.
I was just going to say that's what I watched, and that's why I now have Valhalla, which cost me 50 quid.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
So I'd say though, it's like whether the digital version can emulate the analog version, I think is a different thing in itself, and that some companies will probably do that better than others.
Sure.
But I think it's really more about like the difference between either the digital or analog Lexicon versus Valhalla. Like those two will give a different color. So if you want to introduce something specific to your sound, then it's really going after like that plugin or that piece of gear and understanding what it's giving you, not necessarily like is one better than the other.
I guess it's having a good conceptualization of what you want from that sound, and not necessarily just subscribing to the idea that one is necessarily better than the other inherently, just because it's talking about a 6,000 pound piece of analog gear versus a much cheaper plugin. And just
I definitely asked Steve his opinion on this as well.
But this is it, guys. Like, we're dealing in a real kind of exponential hierarchy of cost, right? And I think the important thing is that there's a range here of plugins that range from like 50 to 1,000, and I don't think there's always that much difference in those reverbs. The ones that are in the box, they can be incredible, but they're very, very, very expensive. And I think being practical about it,
I guess that was sort of the point I was trying to make, is that what measure of difference are you going to get between one or the other that will justify a significant increase in cost?
Well, I want to, if I can, kind of steer back more towards this clip, because this, I asked Steve about this later, about kind of like where you should put your money and time, like where is a better investment of that, and he has some good advice on that. But I think specifically with this clip, talking about kind of the use of reverb, and I think some of the interesting points he brings up here, specifically of like adding bass to that reverb send. And so considering like what I used to do is just more or less have like, okay, I'm going to send all of my strings to the reverb, thinking only in terms of distance. Okay, so I'm going to send my strings to the reverb a little bit less than my brass, than my percussion, stuff like that, so that I can create depth in the mix. But actually, you also need to balance that with the frequency that you're sending. And so to kind of experiment with that maybe your high end will need more reverb. But then I think he also brings up some good points about you can also control and even EQ that either within the reverb plugin or the output of that reverb, how to actually achieve the sound that you're after and kind of making it come through a cohesive space.
Yeah, when I was listening to that, I felt like a little bit of a light bulb moment. Like, oh yeah, I can put an EQ on the reverb send as I send it, as I put things to it, so that, the lower frequencies that I sent to it get tapered down before the reverb gets enacted. So that will automatically mean less mud. That's a really good tip. I'm going to try that.
Yeah. Do you guys have any other sort of?
I also like the comment about trying. It was a bit of an offhand one, but it sparked my imagination a little bit about adding some compression to reverb to the reverb channel in order to try and make sources recorded in different places kind of feel like they came from the same place. I know compression and saturation and even distortion are really useful for kind of gluing things together. So that's interesting to try and use that same philosophy on the reverb channel.
Yeah, Yeah, these things I'm definitely taking away to kind of experiment with and tweak a little bit more specifically. I think then you could have it set up like I have reverb send set up in my template, so that it's sort of pretty much pre-mixed as I write. But then if you can continue to kind of refine these, and reverb was something I definitely found in the past, I don't know, 6 months or so, that I was using too much of it. And like where it would sound fine when it wasn't kind of everybody playing together and it was really nice. Then as soon as I had like 2D orchestra, now I had like 2D bass coming through all of that. And so really trying to regulate it a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, you can use the kind of multi-band idea, right? You could have your signal and you could send it to two places, one of them which cuts out all the low end and the other one which cuts out all the high end, and then apply different amounts or different types of reverb to both of them. That might be a slightly more designed sound, but that might be similar to what Michael was saying, where you could have your bass like middle, down the middle, like very dry, and then your upper partials more wet. That could give you a really like focused but atmospheric sound. So it's interesting to think about those options. Like we always have these options. We just sometimes go, I'll put a reverb on it and move on. But like there's actually, you have a lot of options.
Yeah, it is remarkable playing around with that imager as well, just how different of a sound you can get from, just adjusting the frequencies and where they're distributed. It's really interesting thing that would be, I think everybody should experiment with just a little bit to see if you can find any useful tips or ways to improve your mixes that way. Pretty cool.
Should we jump on? So this next one is, I asked Steve about kind of how do you approach the mix, speaking specifically in kind of like his mix chain. So this comes back to what you were mentioning before about like EQ, then compression, and both that and kind of his organization. Like how does he approach a mix?
I mean, quite often when I'm just handed a load of stems, and I haven't heard anything before, it's just flip it all open, listen to it, and you soon get an idea of where there's a melody or something that's trying to get your attention or the lead. And that's where I would start going to. So I probably have got a selection of cues, pick one that's fairly good balance of all the rest of them. So I can start in the middle, as it were, and work out to the more extreme ones or the different ones. And then hone in on that instrument or that sample, and I'll probably solo it and start thinking, what do I like about it, what do I not? And that's often when I get into EQ. And that's what we were saying at the top, is what can I afford to lose, what do I want to push, so either balance it out more or bring out something that is present and nice about it, and then start adding in the other bits and do a similar kind of thing. But then once you got the basis, you kind of can easily bring in another part of the mix, and quickly you know what you want to EQ about it or change. And compression as well, you know, either for the feel and the sounds that you're trying to create, on percussive things, or just for dynamic range control. When you've got something that's jumping about in the mix so much, the first thing you often want to do is compress it, so you know you can ride it and sit it somewhere it feels more comfortable, and that immediately makes mixing more easy. So often, I'm first working with EQ at the very basic to just minimize what I don't want. Then I'm compressing and balancing, and beyond that, it's kind of then going into more effects and stuff if necessary. In certain cases, you can use a delay instead of any reverb, just to give it a bit of, set it back again in the mix and give it a sense of ambience around it. And then it's just playing around with all those elements, and sometimes just starting from scratch again. So even when you set a balance, just send them all back and start again and see if you come to the same conclusion almost. But definitely signal chain wise, it would be EQ, compression, sometimes more EQ after that, a reverb send into possibly the same reverb across everything, or maybe one or two reverbs I might have, depends on what we're talking about. And then the other things like delays occasionally that you would put across certain samples or instruments. And then, yes, at some point you come to the mastering stage, which is, again, EQ and compression across the stereo mix, which definitely has the help of blending everything together and getting it sitting at the right level. But that's the order I work in, and it is a kind of logical way to run. So I wouldn't mix into a bus that's already compressed or limited or anything, because that will, if you start doing that, you run into lots of trouble. You always have to go back and retweak because you've overcompensated on what you think you were down with. So yeah, always don't mix into a bus that's compressed or limited, or start from scratch and work forward, as it were.
Yeah, I think that's also really helpful, just having a logical system, because when you're talking about gain staging and kind of understanding like, okay, if I'm like, where does my signal sit here? Now at every step, what are you doing to kind of affect that? So if you're also then sending it to a group bus and now you're compressing that, but you're also compressing the original, and you start tweaking those, you might have to kind of keep balancing and rebalancing them. So it's good to have a very sort of logical, like, understanding at what stage am I compressing or using EQ, and like we were saying earlier, do they have different functions? So is this my EQ that is before my compressor in order to cut out the things that I want to compress? And then is this my one after that I want to use to color? I thought that was very helpful.
Yeah, I have to say that to me, one of the best ways to kind of to learn and to find out for myself what was the best process, what was the most logical order, was even just to take some projects that I was mixing and trying to fix, to tweak, to create a good sound for a certain patch or a certain family. And then when I was happy with it, just try to slightly change the order of the plugins just to see what effects that would create, and try to understand, okay, why is that happening? And I think especially the order of EQing and compressing, and like first sort of fixing the sound and then coloring it, like tweaking it, balancing, and then coloring it. I don't know. I think there's a lot to be learned in the trial and error process, when obviously you're not working on a deadline or stuff like that. Just like working with your ear and trying to see, okay, so if I put first this and then that, this is the result. Why is that? And try to then logically understand it backwards.
I thought it was interesting that he mentioned soloing an instrument, because I've like gone through a bit of a journey with the concept of using the solo button. Like I think when I first started writing music and making music, I used it way too much actually, and it really slowed me down and hampered me, because I would like try and make something, and then I would listen to that in solo, and then I'd be like, okay, I like that, and then I would make something else, and then listen to that in solo, and then I'd put them together, and then I'd be like, oh, why don't they work? I liked one and I liked the other. They don't work together. But I think, yeah, to me that was actually a trial that I had to overcome, that now I'm always like, well, yes, I can do something to it in solo, but it's never, I should never get too invested in that, because the greater context matters so much more.
You probably also understand more now at this point, like kind of what we were talking about earlier, like where do you want certain color from different things? So you know kind of, well, I'm operating within this sort of frequency range, for instance, with this instrument or this group. So even though I'm affecting it, I'm really just coloring it, and it's not going to interfere. I probably have a better sense of that now.
Yeah, for sure. I think like your ear is something that just never stops improving. Like I feel like I hear things better now than I have before, and I'm sure in many years I will hear them better than I'm hearing them now. And it's just a good thing to remember that that is another way to improve as a musician, is to just improve how you're hearing things, which is kind of crazy to say, but it is a very important part of it.
Yeah.
There's another tip that he dropped in there about using kind of delays like a reverb. And this is something I actually picked up from Alan Meyerson had, I think it was on Mix with the Masters. and he did kind of an episode where he was mixing one of Dom Lewis's cues from Man in the High Castle, and he takes like the solo flute line that was recorded, and he puts it through a stereo delay. And so with the stereo delay, it's feeding into both the right and the left channel and kind of then bouncing off one another. And this is a typical kind of trick where you can then set the rate of those delays to different intervals. So if you set one at like quarter note and the other at like eighth triplet, then you set essentially the feedback and the response of kind of how they feed into each other fairly low. Then it just gives this extra kind of ambience to the sound, and it gives that same kind of effect that you want of something that has this kind of reverby ambience without actually pushing it back and creating this distance. So you can use that kind of on solo lines where you want them to stay in the forefront but to still sound very ambient. And I've kind of played with that quite a lot, and it's a really helpful sort of trick. So again, I think it comes back to what he was saying at the beginning of that, of like, okay, when I first listen to something and I've got all the stems, what is the main melody? What is the thing that I want to highlight? And, so which instruments do I want to kind of keep in the foreground? And then what are textures? What's my bass? So kind of thinking first in terms of like function of the overall arrangement, and then how to treat them based on that.
Sorry,
One thing I was... Oh, you go ahead, Chenzo.
This is just like a complete off topic, but I love how Sam taking notes every now and then while we talk looks like he's examining. Like this is an exam, and he's like taking
always
notes.
Learning, mate. Always learning.
And then he's gonna give us marks on our performance later.
I feel like I've failed this exam.
Yeah,
I was gonna say something that I was thinking about as well is sometimes, this is just a very general thing, but sometimes when I'm mixing, I look at like an EQ and I'm like, 0 hertz to 20,000 hertz. That's what I'm working with. And sometimes that seems like a lot. But when I think about like the fact that, okay, with every instrument, like acoustic source of sound, the fundamental frequency is always, or almost always, maybe there are exceptions, but usually the highest like response compared to all the other partials. So if all your fundamentals kind of live in the, I don't know what, 80 to 1200 range, I don't know exactly, then there's actually a huge amount of detail work to be done in just the 80 to 1200 range. I don't know the right numbers, but you guys know what I mean. Like basically all of the notes in your piece of music, they're fundamental frequencies. That space in a way to me feels like there might be more detail work that needs to be done there than actually the thousands of frequencies above it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
How do you agree with that? Do you guys feel I'm onto something there?
Yeah, I think when approaching like EQ, especially looking at it in groups, you sort of realize like, oh, actually, I've kind of run out of area. Like I have to be more surgical about kind of which area this group or this color is going to occupy because of that. And so often it's like, well, both the strings and the brass might be giving you warmth that you want. So I'm kind of taking like, okay, I guess just the lower part of this very specific frequency range in the brass, and the higher portion of that still like low mids. It will be strings.
And regarding EQ, I mean, you guys may have known this because you went through the Royal College program, but because I came into this late, this was like a revolutionary.
Yeah, I mean, clearly we're all taking notes still. So
I mean, like for the longest time, I didn't approach EQ in the way I do now, and now I do it almost exclusively with subtractive EQ, which is turned out to be so much better for me when it comes to clarity of mixes. Like you were talking about the detail work needing to be done. So instead of actually boosting the thing you want to hear, subtracting what you don't want to hear in the other instruments to carve out that room. And it obviously, before, because I had no idea what I was doing, was boosting all of the signals, but it was also boosting the room sound, boosting a lot of the mud that would just contribute to a much muddier mix. And so doing that subtractive and actually figuring out, this is the most important thing, I'm going to leave this for now, what can I do to everything else to make room for that thing, to make it seem like it comes to the front. It was a light bulb moment for me. I don't know, maybe this is something that you guys learned on day one, but it really, that was like a quick switch for me in terms of improving the clarity and just overall sound.
I think it's similar to what Shane was saying about doing like brutal low cuts. It's something that I took a long time to learn, but that was massive for me. It's just like not being afraid of slicing it right, right down the middle and getting rid of stuff you don't need at the bottom end.
I think from what I've read and what I've heard, the subtractive thing is like, that's a great starting point. Like, it's almost always going to be the right option. The trick is finding the times when it's not the right option. But I think in like 99% of cases, it's like really good advice. Yeah.
Well, and in a lot of ways, I almost feel like if you're doing the EQ compressor EQ version, you do subtractive before the compressor and then almost additive after, plus some more subtractive, just because then you're sculpting the sound more at that point. But it was just, it really suddenly just everything clicked.
Well, then you get to sort of dynamic EQ as well, don't you? Where it can start being fancy. Yeah, I still don't fully understand how to do that, but I found the FabFilter's EQ is very good for that. Those that have it, yeah, at least I think it's good for that. As I say, I'm still learning.
The isotope ozone has also got a very good adaptive EQ or dynamic EQ.
I think that brings us right into the next one, which is where I was asking Steve about adding kind of color and saturation, and I think he. It's a quicker one, but there's some good tips in.
Saturation, I would generally only save not entirely. That's probably more samples, playing around with samples and effects like that to see what, if you don't feel like it's got enough harmonic interest in the first place, you can start adding things and see if it brings out a different effects, like the entire tonal shape of it, depending on how far you go. But it's much more drastic than EQ in bringing out certain harmonics or unharmonic bits. Yeah, no, it's something to play with, and it can add interest. I wouldn't use it on every mix, or it wouldn't be a go-to, so to speak. But I have on pads and things like that, when I just get what's been recorded out and I don't have access to original settings, I've added some of that to see if I can make it sound a little bit different. Cut, quite often it will give it a bit more top end of a certain sort, and that will help it poke its way through in the mix. So yeah, no, play around with those things and see if it helps. Can't say I've ever used it on, if I'm doing a chamber ensemble or an orchestral mix or anything like that. But I dare say you could get some interesting results, violins especially.
Cool. So, Darren, addressing your question, just what is saturation? So I mentioned briefly earlier, kind of saturation is this coloration and, in effect, a distortion that's introduced by the signal passing through a particular piece of equipment. So if you listen to an older recording, every single step of that process, from the microphone that was used into the preamp and through the compressors, the EQ, all of these are introducing a particular bit of color at that stage. And so if you listen to an older recording, it'll sound kind of maybe a bit warmer in a sense, but it's highly saturated. And so with digital recording, we can record things very cleanly. And so it's using plugins and extra kind of pieces of gear to reintroduce some of what that color is. And so what Steve is kind of suggesting here is kind of, when you're actually recording a live instrument, very rarely would you need to do that, because that's what you're recording. You want to kind of use as much of the real thing as possible without kind of changing that color. But with samples, something I found is, even when you're using kind of like the, brand new Spitfire libraries recorded at Abbey Road with amazing microphones, all of this is still kind of cut down and put into a box so that it can play nicely with itself. So that when you just play across the board, it all sounds good together. So I find with a lot of samples, they typically roll off a lot of the high end as well. just because otherwise it would completely stack up all of these samples playing back. And so they sound maybe a little bit darker than, if you were actually in the room or what was coming through the desk. And so kind of using saturation, there's plugins that are specific to saturation to emulate like a tape machine or something to give you tape saturation. Or different compressors, whether they're the digital or the analog version, that'll be introducing that kind of color to the sound. So that's specifically kind of what we're talking about and sort of where to use it.
Yeah. Would you guys use anything particular on for the coloration of your sound? Lately, I've been experimenting. I know I've talked to Sam about this with tape saturation, the Waves J37, which, Darren, if you've not tried, you should give it a go. They give you a free trial. But I really like, because I guess when it comes down to mixing, it's first determining what recordings you really like. And I think I'm just particularly drawn to sort of, the 70s, 80s, and 90s in terms of film music. So that very acoustic sort of imperfect sounds that you get. And so a lot of times I'll add a little bit of hiss on the plugin to give that more sort of realistic, humanistic aspect, add a little bit of distortion so it wavers here and there. But I honestly just feel that doing a tape saturation over the entire mix in some ways can help blend everything together a little bit more.
Do you know?
I do the same, Michael.
Yeah, adding those sort of extra harmonics up there, making everything a little bit warmer, making it sort of sit in the same space even more than it already is. Just because for me, even the best mock-up I've ever heard still just sounds like samples to me. So this is a way to make it sound a little bit more realistic, I think.
It really is secret sauce in a lot of ways, I think. And you can do it kind of either like some people use it as like a mastering chain, which I don't do sort of philosophically in a way. I don't have like one master output because it makes the way that I do stems a huge pain in the ass. But I do it kind of individually on group stems because I think that also then gives you control over those groups. So I tend to add it to like strings, brass, and winds, and we'll do the same thing, kind of adding a bit of tape saturation. But yeah, also kind of controlling like how much of that and essentially what you're doing. I think if you want to play with this to sort of see what is it actually sort of adding, take a test generator and just play like a sine wave and then have the EQ on that output. And you'll see that it only has a fundamental harmonic. Then turn the tape saturation on and you'll see that in the EQ, all of a sudden there's a few more harmonics that come up. And so it's actually adding new frequencies to your sound. And that's the extra color and timbre that it's changing it with. So if you then think about that with an entire, string section, this is kind of where it's adding these extra harmonics in between the harmonics that are already there.
I think a lot of the plugins you're able to solo those kind of additive frequencies is certainly on the one I use, Magneto too, which I think is just a third-party thing. It's part of like Cubase, but I find it basically it kind of just adds like the vibration of the room for me. It's like the tingle. It makes you ooh. Well, especially with samples, it just means you like it feels a bit more real and a bit more. There's a hum to the room that gives it a kind of live experience. But yeah, like certainly with the one I use, you can solo it to really hear what on earth you're doing to this. And that's really handy. Like Steve was saying with the reverb, just like hearing what you're actually doing by soloing it is really handy.
I was going to ask Mike, did you happen to ask Steve about automation at all?
No, we didn't really talk much about that.
Because that's something that just a short thing to say. I feel like I've improved a lot with my mixing since I've started taking more care and more time with automation. I think maybe it was just laziness or something. I don't know. I was like, yeah, that's a good level for that track, expecting that you can find the right level for the track that's going to work for the whole mix. But like, I don't know why I would have thought that's the case. Like you can't. Like you can add compression to even things out, but if you are willing to put in the time to control things and decide what do I want to hear for as the prominent element, the mid element, the background element, or whatever, however you want to think about it, in the different sections of the piece, that's really valuably invested time.
This is a very interesting topic, I think, because I often find myself on the opposite end of this spectrum, as in I always do a lot
of automation. Oh, okay.
I don't know. I don't know if I
you and I
overdo it.
working together would do the perfect amount.
Yeah, exactly. No, but the thing is, I don't know if I overdo it, but I often ask myself, because I really I rely a lot on automation, as in I've always thought of it as a very powerful tool to kind of like bring out elements, different elements in different sections, as you were saying. And I spend a lot of time on it. And I often ask myself, am I overdoing it? Is it like common practice, or is an approach similar to yours, like finding the right amount of compression and blah blah, so that the volume kind of works for the whole track? Is that a better approach? So I think it's really interesting to talk about this, and to confront our, like see what's our different approach regarding this. Because yeah, I'm not sure there's a correct answer.
It might also depend on the style of music as well. But sorry,
yeah.
It's well, there's an interview I saw with Jake Jackson about this, where he was talking about, like, for composers mixing their own music, you really should think of these as two separate stages, and even just print your stems and then start clean with a mix. And because Jake also mixed my album, and a lot of what I saw him doing is these kind of sort of volume writing, but he would also like just chop up the audio and raise the volume of like that particular region, and then just crossfade them back together. So he could then just kind of highlight and level them a little bit more. And it's exactly that. Like that, I found, is so much of the detailed work of what the mixing engineer is actually doing, is leveling it moment by moment throughout the track to really highlight and have everything come through. And then all of this other, sort of dark art around it with plugins and all of this is really just to make those sounds sound the best that they can be. But I think it's probably almost like orchestration, I feel, is like 80% dynamics. And that's ultimately what it translates into the mix at the end too, is like you're then just balancing the levels to try to bring out those particular colors and moments.
But I think it's important to note as well, though, that it doesn't, when you're worrying about balancing those different levels and colors, I think the important thing is to keep the ratio of the instruments, keep the balance in that moment as the most important thing, as opposed to the overall volume of the track, because then you can adjust the volume of the track at the end. It's just making sure, as you said, Mike, sort of moment by moment, instead of worrying about maybe over automating everything to make sure it stays at the exact same level. As long as it's not peaking or distorting, you can adjust the overall volume automation at the end once you've actually made sure that each individual moment has been taken care of.
I think it's a very like pop music concept, like from what I've seen of people producing pop music. Like if they're editing vocals or whatever, they will literally go in to every single plosive, every single consonant, whatever, chop that one. Okay, that one needs to be plus 3 dB. That one needs to be minus 2 dB in order to create like this artificially perfect listening experience of this vocal performance. So I think if you want that sort of thing and you're willing to do the work, you can really get amazing results that way. But then obviously it has a certain aesthetic. So you have to also want that aesthetic.
Mm-hmm. It's a very Pro Tools thing, I think, as well, to do it that way.
Yeah, I've been doing it in Cubase. I've been working recently on you guys know about it, an audio drama series where I'm working with dialogue. And sometimes the voice actor just hits that P or that B in a way that's too strong or whatever, and just bringing it down 3 dB, like it's such a subtle thing, but it makes a complete difference to how that sentence comes across. And like that has made me think, I could be doing this with music as well.
When I'm mixing stuff for Anemoy, for one of my non-folk music projects, which is basically a folk band, I do that quite often with vocals, and I think this is something that I picked up from a sound engineer that I worked with years and years ago with another band that I used to play with, and just like taking down some P's, some T's, some S's. Sometimes it's just like cut through so much. It's just like a quick automation does the magic.
I'm just going to address a question from Alessandro, talking about Jake and kind of as he differed from American mixing engineers. The fact is, Hans, John Powell, all of those guys work with the same people. I mean, John Powell works with Jake, and Jake actually trained up under Jeff Foster at Air. And Jeff Foster is Hans's guy and is kind of, the probably one of the highest regarded recording and mixing engineers in the world. Shane and I have definitely worked with Jeff quite a lot as well and gotten to know him. And really, at the end of the day, they all have their own process. And I wanted Jeff to mix my album and track it, but he's just too good for me to afford. So it's which wasn't like getting the lesser version by getting Jake in any way. It was getting a different version. It was getting just a completely different engineer. So think of it really like different mixing engineers. I mean, Alan Meyerson is one of the most famous kind of American ones based in LA. But it's they'll either record with one of the guys out here, because most things are recorded at Air Abbey Road anyway, whether the composer's based here or not, and then maybe they work with their sort of preferred engineer. I think that's really what it comes down to, is getting to know the people that you're working with, because you'll soon realize, okay, I've now kind of had to communicate what I want out of my mix with this person. And after you do that on a few projects, you really know what they're good at, and they really know kind of what you want out of it. And I think that's an incredibly valuable thing at any stage. And I've known composers who have worked with different engineers, fallen out with different engineers, not to name any names, and to have to kind of figure out that process for themselves. So I think it's the same whether you're a student now or if you're 30 years down the road. There's no secret to why these guys work with the same people all the time, because they found someone they like, and they just keep going.
Like any collaborative relationship, I guess if you're developing a shorthand and an understanding, it's just going to let you get to the right answer that much faster.
I was going to say on that, it's worth, if you're lucky enough to observe these people in a session, then get to know the Pro Tools op as well, who's sat next to the mixer, because they're the mixer of the future. That's what Jake Jackson was to Jeff. He was the one doing all the crazy.
And it's just like a fireworks show watching an amazing Pro Tools op go. It's unbelievable.
Incredible.
Jake was originally a tape op when he started, when they used tape, and then now the tape op is a Pro Tools op. So the next one, I asked Steve, what are some of the most common kind of issues that you find in a lot of student mixes, as somebody who's worked with so many different student projects over the years? And so I think it's interesting what he has to say.
It's quite often things are pushed a lot to the fore. Everything seems very upfront. And there's perhaps not as much use of being much more subtle about how a sound could be quieter in the background and still be relevant to the mix. Creating that sense of distance and an air around it with the reverbs. I have seen it when people used a reverb plugin on every channel in a mix, which immediately runs into trouble. You're not mixing into the same reverb setting or sound, so they're all doing different things to mix these reverb plugins. And I think it's harder to mix that way, and you're making yourself work harder to try and balance it. So, creating an auxiliary bus, feed your reverb into that. Often not, I don't know if it's clarity, but swaying either too much that you haven't brought out the top end in the general sounds, and so it seems it's not muddy, but there's just not the clarity that you would expect. Or vice versa, they push that so much it's quite brittle to your ears, and these are easy things to happen, because once you lean one way or the other, you tend to add it to everything in the mix. So it all becomes too bright, or a little under bright, or too much in the mids. So noticing if, watching out for that, does it all sound a bit pushed one way or the other? And learning that it's better to spread that across the individual elements, figuring out what suits the bottom end, what suits the top, where can I push it, where can I put it back? And that means all the instrument samples sit somewhere in that spectrum, and it's much more, it gives you clarity that you're looking for, I think. I think sometimes when I've seen the chain of plugins, there's been, if you step to EG compression in that order, I think it's a good start, because compressing things will often bring up other things that you might want to, like the bottom end, that you want to get rid of first before you start doing that. So, having a logical order, don't just throw the plugins there as you think about what you're doing. I tell you one thing, if you're sending on stems, do think about whether you need to send stereo or mono, because if you're bouncing out your individual things with panning and you've done some leveling already, grand, give me a stereo. But if I end up with 24 stereo mixes and everything's effectively down the middle in a mono, you've already made everyone's life more hard. That's something to bear in mind.
Yeah, I wonder, do you guys have any of the listeners, viewers, kind of thoughts on some of this, or maybe some realizations, things that you've been doing in your own mixes, that kind of thing?
Well, one thing I'd like to say, which is something that I don't do as often as I should, but I know that I'm supposed to be doing, is use reference mixes. I was just thinking about it when he was talking about sometimes having too bright a sound or too dark a sound in the upper partials. And I thought to myself, now, how can I know if I put an analyzer on my track, what I'm going for, what I should look like? And I'm like, oh yeah, I can just put an analyzer on a reference mix that I already think sounds good, and then see how those frequencies are distributed and try and, in some sense, recreate that distribution. So reference mixes are good, and I should do as I say, not as I do, because I
This
don't
is
do
what
it
I
enough.
was. This is what I was actually going to ask you guys about. Do you have a specific reference track that you tend to reference, let's say for orchestral mixes or something like that, or do you tend to find a track that you think sounds similar, and then use it specifically for that mix? Because I know when it comes to pop music, there's a list of standard tracks that they use for reference, but when it comes to orchestral music, I don't think that's as widely known. So.
But
Do you guys have anything in particular that you use, or a specific composer whose mixes you really enjoy and you think have a lot of clarity?
I think that changes a lot personally, because like depending on, even within film music, like John Williams's orchestras, like John Williams's orchestral pieces and John Powell's orchestral pieces and Hans Zimmer's orchestral pieces, they sound radically different depending on lots of things. The orchestra, the place where it was recorded, the sound engineer. But in general, there's kind of like the more traditional, romantic symphonic orchestra sound, the more hyper produced Hans Zimmer thing, the more kind of like John Powell approach, which is a little bit in the middle. So um, I think it's important to know what you're going for before finding reference tracks. And I want to say something also regarding what Shane was saying. I think using reference mixes is also useful in terms of like kind of like a simpler approach that goes kind of like a step back from like putting the EQ analyzer and seeing how frequencies are distributing. But like I found this out when I was trying to do earlier, actually at the end of last year, a mock-up of Rue's Farewell, one of the cues from What's Going On in the Chat.
I'm sorry, I'm getting scolded.
So Michael's trolling.
Michael was trying to rickroll the viewers.
Okay. Anyway, I was saying I tried to do a mock-up of a cue from Jane News an Hour from Hunger Games, and listening to the original track and trying to make each individual family sound like it sounds in the original track was useful, and it kind of opened my mind about if I'm composing a cue and I want it to sound in a specific way, trying to see how individual elements on that mix sound and try to recreate it even just by ear. Oh, strings are closer, they're warmer, they're more reverbs, blah blah blah. I think helps a lot, and this is something that I remembered that a friend of mine years and years ago, again when I was working with some bands, told me it's kind of a common thing in pop to make a specific song like sound like another song in a specific genre, in a specific style, just by copying single element. The drums need to sound this way, the guitars need to sound that way, blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna catch up with Michael being scored.
Oh yeah. No,
But yeah, I
it's
think
really interesting to me just because I sorry, Shane, I'm going to quickly just say this so I don't forget. Just because I feel like it probably ends up differing from project to project, the sort of sound you're looking for. But at the same time, I think to a certain extent, we all have sort of a stylized mixed sound that we enjoy, or specific genre or specific era of recordings that we would like, either the hyper realistic John Powell stuff, the more sort of roomy John Williams stuff. There's a wide variety of things, and it's just I was curious, especially if any of you use sort of the How to Train Your Dragon or any of the John Powell scores as reference, just because so much of those instruments are very close up front in the mix. And I think that a lot of the sample libraries that are available are not necessarily conducive to that immediacy of sound. And so I was just curious if you all use that for reference and how you would approach.
I would. Yeah, I mean not exclusively, obviously, because it, like you say, it does depend. But I very rarely am able to not love a John Powell mix. So well, I guess it's Sean Murphy. I think is really his go-to mix guy. He's the guy that goes to his custom-made studio
Yeah.
in that bigger room, and yeah. But I just think I know what you're saying, because like John Williams is realistic.
Mm-hmm.
And like you can hear noises going on, and you're part of the room. But John Powell, everything is so clear.
Mm-hmm.
And if you in learning how to achieve that, I think it's good. Again, I like should practice what I preach. I should put the track in my project and listen to it, but I don't. But yeah, that would be my kind of go-to.
Yeah,
my aspiring, my aspiration is to sound like that.
It's just interesting because in that approach, I almost feel like the modern orchestral film score is approached like pop music in a way, because a lot of times you'll have the percussion panned hard left or hard right and very close up, like you would with drums or guitar or something like that. And it's just a very, very different style from obviously what came before. And of course it differs from project to project, but yeah, getting that hyper realistic sound is very difficult.
Another one worth mentioning, sorry guys, that just because I've been listening to him a lot recently, is Ludwig Göransson, of recent Tenet fame, but also I've been listening to Black Panther a lot, and his mixes sound incredible. Like, and I don't know how much he does himself, or I know nothing about who does his mixes. I just know they sound great. So if you're kind of going for hybrid scores, like, he's a good reference for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, also Junkie XL. Like, I think Tom Holkenberg is one of the only people in Hollywood working at that level that completely mixes his own projects. He doesn't work with anyone else, but that's because he is a legit producer. And so he will just record at Air or Abbey Road and get the session and then do it himself. And, that's someone who has hours and hours of YouTube tutorials to kind of talk about it. So I think that's a great starting point, a great place to go look at. Yeah, also Ben Wallfish, I think, is someone who has this really hyper realistic sound that is using, I mean, sort of, following on a lot of what Hans does, sort of using the orchestra in parts like a pop track or a dance music track, something that, like, okay, my strings are recorded separately and isolated in this thing. Now I'm going to put them specifically in this place mixed with all these other elements, rather than thinking in terms of, like, the group in a room, because it's often not how they even record it.
Yeah, Ben Wallfish is a good one, because he's somewhere between his two kind of mentors. He started with Dario Marinelli, who's a bit more the John Williams school, perhaps a bit more like real, this is the room. And then Hans Zimmer, he's more recently kind of partnered with, I should say. But like, he's got a very kind of polished sound, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And his music's great.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think, yeah, you're absolutely right, Michael. In the general case, you should first decide what kind of aesthetic am I going for and why, and then choose your reference mix based on that. But I was going to say, in terms of like the hyper produced thing, just a little tip that I often forget about, like, don't forget that in most sample libraries, you can go into the instrument and you can balance the spot, room, and tree microphones or whatever. And you can actually achieve a lot of variance through the same sample library just by playing with those. And sometimes turning all of the mics except for the close mics off can give you a really particularly cutting sound that you need to bring the mix together. And don't forget you have that option.
I suppose,
that's a reminder to me as much as anyone else.
That's absolutely a good point. I guess the only downside is that when you have such a close mic sound on a sample, you lose some sort of that realism just because you're not able to play it as
absolutely
accurately as a human. But I understand what you're saying completely.
What I would do if you find yourself in that situation is maybe take like the close mics from one library and the mid mics from another library. Sometimes that can give you, get the absolute best of both worlds there.
I've started to actually do that where, like, on my, I have like 9 faders on my keyboard or something, and some of those are dedicated to the mic positions, because then it makes it super simple to kind of balance and play with that sound a little bit. So you can just kind of, without having to really mess with your template too much, all of those parameters can also just be automated.
That's a really good idea. I'm stealing that.
So this last clip that I got from Steve, I asked him kind of what advice he would give, pretty much with like limited budget, like where is the best place to invest your money and time? And without it being too much of a leading question, because I think it's all pretty clear kind of how we feel about this, that, a lot of people are gearheads and think I need the next plugin or I need this piece of gear, and only with that would my mix be amazing. And really just
don't subscribe to the Waves mailing list.
Yeah. Or Spitfire for that
Guilty.
matter. I've muted them on Instagram. This is just too much bullshit. But there's so kind of like what's the best thing to do with a limited sort of budget, and where you could, if you're going to invest your time into something, what should that be with?
Not to say there isn't a difference in quality of plugins out there, but learning what can be achieved from each in its entirety. So your compressors that you already have just built into any DAW, you can use that and get the effects you want and turn it into a limiter. And it's just learning about how those things work with the ratios and the attacks, and playing around with that, understanding what's going on, rather than just buying the plugin that suddenly adds a massive whack because it's basically got the inbuilt settings to be working as a limiter almost already. You can do a lot with just the most basic plugins, and like playing around with EQ, learning what you can do with that. It sounds simple, but buying a revered EQ off, I don't know, an SSL or something like that, it's not going to suddenly make it 10 times better. It's learning where you want to pull or push the frequencies, playing around with that. And I think, yes, I'd agree, time well spent is in reading up about it, using it, testing out, theories and ideas, and seeing what happens, or hearing what happens. And you'll get to appreciate you can achieve a lot. I've done loads of stuff with just what comes with Pro Tools, and then a few odd plugins that we have occasionally to add stuff. Lucky that some of the outboard kit we've got in the studio can use that instead. So we've got reverbs and EQs here. Speaking and saturation, that obviously we've got some nice outboard that we can put across stereo mix, and that definitely has an effect, and it is something I like. But again, I've spent a lot of time getting to know it.
Yeah.
I haven't just decided it's great outright. It's learning what these random numbers mean. They don't really relate to anything. I'm just listening to it and going, okay, that's too much, that's too little, and love to have more of them. But in a way, I'd rather invest money in something like that outboard kit that I've grown to know and use and feel like I can get a few different effects out of, and put a load of money into that and narrow my choices perhaps, than buy loads of plugins and expect them all to improve the mix outright. I think a few well chosen ones that you're happy with, and try and stick to that. Work with what you got and see if you can improve it from first steps, as it were, before you start indulging in lots of stuff.
I think there's an interesting bit in that he mentions kind of limiting your choices. And I think, it's like if you're given kind of a day in the studio where you've got a bunch of outboard gear in front of you that you have no idea sort of what it does, immediately it forces you to kind of just work with a sort of limited skill set, limited, bit of that plugin or of that, piece of gear, something like that. And I think it then makes you really appreciate kind of what it does. And often I've definitely been guilty of this, as kind of getting like, the Waves Platinum bundle. Now I have kind of a version of anything that I could possibly need. And ultimately, I haven't even opened 90% of them, because it's just so much that comes with it. And so then you just kind of find a couple go-tos and you don't really, explore them. So I think there's a lot of value in that, in kind of like doing some research, figuring out what do I really want out of this, whether it's a software plugin or a piece of analog kit, and getting to know it like an instrument, like an extension of your sound. And then that can become something that's particular to the sound that you make.
I think it's kind of like, buying a ton of guitar pedals doesn't make you a good guitarist. Like you've got to know what you're doing, and you guys will giggle because I'm very guilty of this, of not finding out how to do it. And what that does mean is that I guess I like something that's at least intuitive. Getting a plugin that is easy on the eye, it does what it says on the tin. And I have found, like, for EQ and compression and limiting, that the fab filters are very nice for that. They suit me because I need it to be fun to use, because I'm hopeless otherwise. But I don't know what you guys think if you've used fab filters, but I think particularly like their EQ and their compressor is really nice to use.
I don't know. I've used the Ozone EQ and compressor, which I really enjoy as well. But at the same time, I can't help but think, like, in relation, because I'm constantly guilty of trialing every plugin on the face of the earth, and then inevitably buying it when it goes on sale. I'm looking at you, Darren. So basically what I think, like, my philosophy behind this is just use the basic stock plugins that come in with your DAW and get a really good understanding of what does what. Because if you get a plugin that does something extra special, instead of relying on the extra special thing to make your mix work, I'd rather know how to do that on something that we're less advanced, even though it's not fundamentally less advanced, and then have that knowledge going into something a little bit better, knowing that I need that extra thing. Does that make sense? I guess it's just not sort of buying into the sort of the snake oil salesman pitch of, this will automatically make your mix so much better. I mean, it won't if you don't understand how to work it, and you're not going to know how to work this any better than you would the standard stock plugins that you have. So
yeah, they all essentially do the same thing. The biggest variable is your competency in using it. Yeah. So knowing how to use it is the absolute fundamental. And like you said, the basic versions, learn them first.
I'm almost exclusively use inbuilt plugins most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like for EQ and compression and stuff, I just use the stock Logic and Cubase. And even in Logic, I tend to go for the Space Designer because it's a fantastic reverb plugin.
Mm-hmm. I love the Space Designer.
There's so much kind of within those already that then, if you get to know them, then, and it also makes it much easier to translate from system to system, because if you have Logic, you have them. But I think there's so much in that, like, it's made me think, okay, at some point, I would start investing in bits of outboard gear here and there, but really special ones, and have a special purpose. Like, I have an analog synth, and I really got to know what that machine can do, and it's an instrument like any of my guitars or something.
I feel like in a lot of ways, it sort of like relates to sample libraries as well. There's always the temptation to want to buy the newest and next one, but it's working with the tools that you have. And if you're going to buy something, make sure that it's going to be the extra special sauce on top of an already, delicious meal,
or make sure it's something, to use your analogy, that you don't already have in the cupboard. You know what I mean? Like there's
Exactly.
stuff that like, oh, if I could buy this sample library, I could make this sound. And it's like, actually, I can already make that sound if I just take what I have and work with it and figure out how it works. And yeah.
Exactly. In the same way that limiting your palette when it comes to composing as well can create creative outcomes and creative ideas. I think the exact same thing can be applied to plugins and sample libraries. So it's just not getting too excited by the clever and guerrilla marketing campaigns of most audio companies nowadays, and just working with what you have first and foremost.
Yeah, know that none of those businesses are in the business of composing.
Yeah.
They're in the business of selling software. They're software companies.
Mm-hmm.
So they're, with ads like less theory, more composing. It has nothing to do with the composition world.
That was very, very discreet and subtle. But much
All right,
needed.
guys. Well, a lovely chat about mixing. I'm feeling ready to mix something.
Yeah. I think there's some really, valuable golden nuggets with Steve. And to kind of top that off, I would definitely recommend, with a few £100 on a project, hire a mixing engineer and go and sit with them and go through the mix and watch what they do. You'll learn so much from that, just like you would hiring a cellist and getting them to perform your part instead of doing it with samples. These are amazing collaborators and they're experts in their field. So fantastic, guys. So thank you so much for joining us for the past 8 weeks. This has been, I think, the best season yet, and how we've sort of been able to bring all of these things in. And this kind of thing is definitely something we want to do more of. So we're happy for any of your feedback on the things that you like the most, and just reach out on social media channels and stuff like that if there's something you want more of, you'd like to see in a future season. We don't know when the next season will start up yet. We're kind of just taking our time and doing it when it feels right. And also, it seems like all of us are kind of busy at the moment with various things, and so we'll see kind of when we can put that together. But just stay posted on social media and stay in touch with us. We're also here, so even on the Facebook page or Instagram or something like that, if you want to reach out and ask questions, or share some of your stuff with us, we can keep this community going. It doesn't have to kind of only exist in the chat.
I had a moment this afternoon when I was doing some work for today's session, and I realized, man, it's been already 8 weeks. This season really went fast, and I think the sense of community that built up through this shared project, also with Vicky's film, I don't know, it's been really enjoyable. And I had a moment when I thought, man, it's so sad that it's already ending, and I'm already looking forward to next season.
And Chenzo, don't be sad that it's over. Be glad that it happened.
Sorry?
You're going to make me cry.
I think the Darren's suggestion of a Discord chat is a really good one. I enjoy Discord, and I think it also makes everybody very easily accessible. And so it's essentially like sort of setting up a chat room, and kind of it's also a place that you can sort of stream through and do live things and whatever.
And you can just set up little audio chats in there, which is cool. It's very good.
Yeah, it's like all the best bits of a bunch of different social media apps.
Yeah, all in one
no
place.
Clubhouse then.
It's the good parts of Clubhouse without all of the like idiots, young investors. So so I think just we also have the website, and you can email through that and things like that. But yeah, I think maybe that'll be kind of a next move to kind of keep things going in the interim. But we've got some other ideas of things that we could go forward with, and we really just love kind of sharing in this, and especially the work reviews and that kind of thing. It feels like it's something we can really offer, not just us to you, but the entire community to each other, to kind of keep helping out. So great, guys. I think we'll call it a night there. And we look forward to staying in touch with you guys.
let's hope we'll see each other very, very soon.
Yes.
Thanks,
yeah,
guys.
maybe a live event at some point.
There we go.
Oh,
Mixer.
yeah.
Mixer.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, guys.